think we can start. So, welcome to another book talk organized by the International Society for the Critical Study of Divination. My name is Michael Lackner, or Michael Lackner, and I have the honor to work as the president of the society. You find our website here, criticaldivination.com. The society was established in 2016 in the framework of the International Consortium for Research in the Humanities with the title Fate, Freedom and Prognostication, Strategies of Coping with the Future and in East Asia and Europe. Now, since 2023, the Society acts as a successor for the consortium, whose funding by the German Ministry of Education and Research lasted 14 years from 2009 to 2023. And during this period, we edited a book series with Brill Leiden with 11 volumes so far, and more volumes are in preparation. In addition, we also edit a journal entitled International Journal of Divination and Prognostication, also with Brill. And together with the book series, Prognostication in History, and this journal, the Consortium, and now the Society for the Critical Study of Divination have established the research of pre-modern forms of prediction, forecasting, prognosis, briefly strategies of coping with the future, as I think a solid consolidated field within the humanities. Now, following an idea of our colleague, Dr. Li Gang, we started to stage a series of talks on the books that have been published so far, and it is my pleasure to host these talks, which began with the most recent book in the series, Prognostication in History, and now continue with other publications that are relevant to our topic. Our talks can also be found on YouTube. Yeah. And the next talk is scheduled for October 2025. And we are still looking for the next book to be discussed. Now, I have the pleasure to introduce our speakers. Let me first say that is a series of concomitancies today, because two of the contributors to the book we will be talking about in a few minutes, Elena Valusi and Constance Cook, have spent a year at my university as visiting fellows, and Dominique Herzer has also spent half a year, and she's going to spend another half year. This is the first concomitance. And the second is that all three speakers today are scholar practitioners who are rare birds in academia. Academia is still a bit reticent, if not to say reluctant, to accept scholar practitioners, as you might know. And we are really looking for more of your kind, if I may say. Now, first of all, Johan Hausen, and excuse my German pronunciation of your name that sounds so familiar to a German person. He is an independent scholar. He currently places his focus on practical application of Chinese medicine, and he is moreover and foremost the founder of Purple Cloud Press. Hausen wrote an introduction to the Duke of Zhou's interpretation of dreams and an essay on the character of the Duke of Zhou. And I had the pleasure to contribute a small statement to that book. He started his martial arts endeavors at the age of 13 by taking up the Korean art of Taekwondo. And now planning to publish more under the umbrella of Purple Cloud Press. He hopes to widen his scope of treatment modalities with the ultimate goal of opening a longevity center under the banner of the Purple Cloud Institute. Now we have publications, the 49 Barriers of Cultivating the Tao by Xing, and The Art of Taoism by Xing De, I Ching Ethics, Lessons of a Taoist Master from the Wudang Mountains, and so on and so forth. Now, the next speaker is Justin Penoyer, if I pronounce that correctly. It sounds French to me, so I prefer the French. He is an independent scholar, a doctor of Chinese medicine and licensed acupuncturist specializing in comprehensive family care and integrative medical case management, and earned his Master of Science in Traditional Chinese Medicine in 2009 and a doctorate of acupuncture and Chinese medicine in 2016, consulting on classical treatment strategies. And he has also written a contribution to the book we will be talking about in a few minutes. And I come to Dominic Herzer. We are in Chinese called Tongxue because we had the same advisor at Munich University. She studied at LMU Munich with the thesis on the book of with the thesis on the I Ching, the Book of Changes of Ma Wangdui. She did another bachelor in traditional Chinese medicine college for TCM in Tianjin, China, and a second PhD in the history of medicine at the University of Witten-Herdecke. I won't quote all her publications, but the publications turn around. There is a publication on shamans, in fact, ritual masters or healers, a critical reflection from a philosophical perspective, and many others. So concomitances, serendipitous connections, if I may say, and welcome to the presentation of this book on the legacy of Chinese shamanism, the Wu and their successors. And I think I hand over to Johan Hausen for his presentation, and then we see what will be happening.
Thank you very much. I want to, of course, express my gratitude for giving me this opportunity to talk about this book on shamanism. So I'm going to use the word shamanism a little bit more liberal because the word Wu sometimes is a little bit hard to put into the English language and then people might get confused. And I will talk about this in depth within the presentation. Just about the book, it was really my wish because there's a lot of misrepresentation in my view on Chinese shamanism. And this spans across a lot of different disciplines. So we find it in Chinese medicine, we find it in Taoism, so in spirituality and religion. And so I often come across things like shamanistic or shaman healing, shamanistic acupuncture, shamanism is the root of Taoism, of Chinese medicine. And so I decided I want to actually see is this true or not. And I realized very quickly that I didn't know very much other than maybe some popular beliefs or what has been spread around. And so my goal really was to get a group of scholar practitioners together who would look at the textual evidence. So this is not about opinion, what you like, what you dislike. This is what is passed on to us through the text and the literature. And so I really approached it probably with an empty cup. And I planned to have published it a year ago. And some people said they could make it. No one could make it by that date, other than Gene Anderson. He was very quick. And it took me another year just to do enough research because I decided to go to the Shang Dynasty, where we have the first written records. And I'm no Shang Dynasty expert, so I had to do a lot of research. And I'm not claiming to be an expert on it, but there has been some research, some very good research has been done. So I think I can bring forward some more founded claims. The other thing I want to explain is that my take on things is as soon as something is said, may that be in a presentation or written black on white in a book, there's a form of accountability. And so anything I say here or anything I've written is up to be contested. And I think there's something called a healthy academic discussion. And I really invite that part of academia and scholarship. And so that's why I will mention names throughout this, what people said, because it's out there. It's not like I'm taking it out of context. And so I want to start with a little paragraph which reads, a shaman is someone who is able to look up, to look down, to look into the consciousness of the person that he or she is working with and understand the light, the heaven, the earth that's in that person. A shaman is basically someone who goes from one dimension into another dimension of another being. This is the Chinese character for shaman, Wu. In fact, this was the first character that represented medicine. I would say not only in Chinese culture, in all ancient cultures, the first type of healers were shamans. And this was said by Jeffrey Yuan, who is a Taoist practitioner, but also Chinese medicine practitioner in Ashley. And it sparked a lot of discussion. This was in Facebook of people, there's historical problems with this. And I think, or I hope by the end of my presentation, some of my criticism will be more evident on what he said about shamanism. So I wanted to focus on the term. Is a shaman, can we use the word shaman instead of the word Wu? Is an Wu a shaman or a type of shaman? And for this, I want to refer to some parts in the book. So specifically, Gene Anderson focused on this. I didn't focus on this so much. Every contributor had a different focus in their chapter. And he wrote, and he was quoting Feng Qu, who also has an article in the book, that this term shaman is depicting different religious specialists. And there's actually two types of them. One is a clan shaman, a Poryun. And this person, this clan shaman, deals with the soul of the ancestors by using sacrifices and prayers. Another type is the wild shaman, who uses spirit possession as a method to create a communication with the upper realms or the spirit and their own community. And so he summed up that shamanism applies to religious practice in which an individual practitioner, and this does not have to be part of a formal religion, goes into a trance state. And this becomes more important later on. And then they send their own soul to the other world. So this idea of journeying to a different world. And through this journey, they want to find the causes and the cures of worldly problems. Often this has to do with disease and illness. Sometimes they're assisted by drumming. So I put a drum behind me, and I've seen people advertise the services as shamanic drumming. This is not a shamanic drum. It's actually a dragon dance drum. But it's very easy to fall into these pitfalls. He also said they would stare at bright lights in a darkened tent or room, they would chant, or they would use other hypnotic activities in order to get into that trance state. And so there is one, I will call it a camp, and Casey Chung belongs to them, where he says that these shamans, or Wu in China, they were intoxicated by drinking vast amounts of alcohol because they found big shang vessels, and there is proof that they were filled with alcohol. So my counter argument to that is, we know there's alcohol in it, but for me, it's difficult to believe that every day they would intoxicate themselves. They would suffer a lot, they would get very sick. They would maybe sometimes not even be able to perform these rites or rituals. And David Kitely is a little bit in the other camp, because he said, when we look at the language in the oracle bone inscriptions or OBIs, it's very stoic. He would even label it Confucianist or Ruist, which of course only came into existence much later. But when you read them, it's kind of hard to imagine that they would be wearing like masks with like bird feathers and drumming wildly and dancing around like dervishes and being absolutely intoxicated, maybe on alcohol or other substances. It just doesn't shine through in the way the language is phrased. Of course, there's no evidence where it says they did not drink alcohol, because the oracle bones are very succinct and very to the point. So he really deduces that from the way the language presents itself. And for me, it's kind of hard to imagine that these were like almost like orgy-like rituals when there's not a single word written about this. Then in contrast to this idea of a shaman sending out the soul, there's the spirit medium. So Gene Anderson distinguishes between a shaman and a spirit medium. And the spirit medium, they receive the soul from the other world. So the shaman is sending it out, the spirit medium makes him or herself a vessel to receive this deity or entity. And then we'll speak with the voice of such entity. And we know this under the phrase of possession. And I think most people are quite clear about this idea. But in practice, many practitioners did both. They sent their soul out, but they also received. And so in the scholarly world, mostly the term shaman is actually limited to the Siberian area, centering on Siberia and Eastern Asia. And so we can think about this as the spirit medium, we can think about as possession trancing, which is much more widespread. We find this in Southern Africa, in the evangelical Christians of America, whereas this soul sending, this shamanistic trait is much less common. And so he said the soul sending also includes sometimes dancing with a small sword or mirror, which is part of an exorcistic ritual, special costumes. And it's, as I said, dancing, drumming, and it's fundamental to the Siberian shamans, the Mongols, the Turkic and Tungus groups. So it's kind of a smaller area. And again, the goal is also of this soul sending is to find out about illnesses and eradicating bad things. And then I want to jump to another scholar, another author, Arthur Waley, in his 9 songs, a study of shamanism in ancient China, which takes place in the Chu kingdom. And he quoted, he said, "Indeed, the functions of the Chinese Wu were so like those of Siberian and Tungus shamans that it is convenient to use shaman as a translation of Wu. The Wu were magic healers, and in later times, at any rate, one of their methods of doctoring was to go, as Siberian shamans do, to the underworld and find out how the power of death can be propitiated." And so it's actually quite true that the shamans, the Wu in China, were involved in funeral rites and mourning rites, and therefore their profession later on, we find that in the Zhou dynasty, is more looked down upon and more feared. So I do see that being the case in China as well. I think it's Gilles Boileau, he doesn't like that he says it's convenient without giving further evidence. And I want to jump to Gilles Boileau in his article, Wu and Shaman. And he says the Siberian shaman in a hunting society is characterized by an exchange between the human society and nature as the provider of food. And they are of equal status. And that's very important. I'm just going to give it the term horizontal hierarchy. It's not up, above and below. It's on the same plane. They want something from nature, and they are also within that nature. They both live in the realm of nature. And we find this metaphor of marriage where the shaman tries to seduce the daughter of the spirit of the forest. So there's sexual connotations. Some people are very much focused on this when it comes to the 9 songs. And there is some good arguments for that. But when we look at when these hunting societies moved into herding or animal husbandry society, the structure becomes more complex and the shaman is actually reduced or marginalized to a function of just giving private healing cures or healing sessions. And so I actually am of the opinion that the word shaman is primarily not fitting or suitable because it's of the difference in Siberia with a horizontal hierarchy, whereas in China you clearly have a vertical hierarchy where there's an above and below, there's the deity and the ancestors, and there's the human realm. And therefore I don't find it a very fitting term. I think it's unfortunate that the Chinese term is Wu because I think it's particularly hard for people to get their head around. And so when we look at the oracle bone inscriptions, we see that they're not, Gilles Boileau said they're not very elevated. They're still around the king, so I still think they're elevated to the common populace. But they also don't have a great deal of autonomy. They don't seem to have a lot of political functions, and their involvement in sacrifice seems limited. I want to say quickly a few words about this. It always says a sacrifice has been executed or implemented by the king. For me, it's hard to imagine that the king did all the sacrificial rituals. And I don't know if there was another class of people doing it or if he really was doing it all by himself, but I do think the king would have been tremendously busy, and that's not usually what kings want to do with all of their days. So for me, it would make sense if some of the shamans would actually take that role, but it has to be the king in the records, because the king is in charge of everything, because he's also mentioned as always interpreting the cracks in the bones, and it's highly unlikely that he interpreted all the cracks. It's just too many of them. The other problem with this term U is it can be designating a territory. It could be designating people living in the territory. When we look at textual sources from the Zhou dynasty, it could be a spirit in charge of the territory, and it could be the name of a function. So the term U itself is not always a person, which makes the whole problem more complex and intricate. And then when we look at the Zhou dynasty, the U in the hierarchy of officials and offices, they are commanded by others. And in Siberia, this hierarchy does not exist. So we have another reason why this term shaman might not be so accurate. And then I wanted to look at the healing aspect of a shaman and an U and see if there are parallels. So in Siberia, the shaman also is in charge of cures and healing. He does that by identifying the spirit who caused the disease as the causative agent, and then he negotiates a proper way to appease or mitigate that deity through offerings and sacrifices. And this is exactly, I would say, the same in the Shang dynasty, really, with the oracle bones. And I will have two examples. Gilles Boileau said in archaic China, exorcism by the U was simply implemented by expelling the evil spirit. And I don't agree with that based on the two examples I want to give. They come from the oracle bone inscriptions, from a text called the Combined Collections of Oracle Bone Inscriptions, Jiagu Wenheji. And it says, the king read the cracks and said, Jia, which is the name of a shaman, I assume, should make an offering to ghosts, or else there will be disease. So clearly we can see from this example, and I have another one in a second, that they were making offerings. The second one is very similar, crack making on the day of Guizhou, which is the 50th of the 60 heavenly stems and earthly branches used to measure time. Chue, another shaman, I assume, divined in 10 days will there be disaster. So in China, a week was 10 days, just like the heavenly stems. The king read the cracks and said an offering should be made to ghosts. So this is how I see academia. Someone makes a statement, you find a counter argument, which you show with textual evidence and proof, which I think those two examples from the oracle bone inscriptions do make. Then my last point, I wanted to talk about gendering. And this is, I'm basing this on Scott Barnwell's chapter, which is called Journeying Beyond Shamanism, the U and the Zhuangzi. And I find a lot of people propagate and spread that the U are basically all female. And then when it gets a bit more scholarly, later on in later stages, they probably were either male or female. So Scott Barnwell, he looked at this text who has two terms for male and female. It comes from the sayings of the states, or the Goyu. And it says the U denotes a female religious functionary. We find the same notion in the Shouwen Jiezi. It's a bit awkward to translate. I tried it as the explanations of scripts and explications of characters, which is a very famous dictionary. It's not the first one though, from the Han Dynasty. And in it, it says the U are kind of invocator or Zhu. They are women able to work with the formless, invisible, in brackets, entities, using dance to cause the spirits to descend. So this descent is important, which in Chinese is xia, which is the idea that Gene Anderson calls a spirit medium. We turn ourselves into a medium to allow the spirit to come into us. And so even though then the Goyu and the Shouwen Jiezi, they provide another term for male shamans, which is Xi. And it says it's men who perform the same services. And so the problem is the word Xi doesn't really appear much other than in these two texts. And so it's very uncommon in the received literature. And of course, one could argue, well, they were all women, there were hardly any men. But then I think it deserves merit when we look at the rites of the Zhou dynasty, the Zhouli, where it gives different expressions. So it has a term Nu is female, U is shaman, and Nan is male, U is shaman, for those two. So my argument, and I think, so Scott says it's not so clear. We can't really just based on these two texts make a claim that they were all female. So when I look at the Shang dynasty oracle bones, it's very patriarchal. And I know there are claims about the Shang dynasty having been a matrimony and then changed into a patriarchy. From the oracle bones, I don't see this. There's not a single queen that is in charge. It's all kings. Of course, he could have surrounded himself by female shamans, but in a patriarchal society, I doubt that a little bit. Again, I don't think there's a final conclusion to this. But then when you look at the Zhou dynasty, and they specifically refer to a New Wu and a Nan Wu, why did they have to introduce these terms if Wu and Qi was so established? They would have already had a terminology for it. And so I think we have to be careful, and this applies to things like we do have a record of a shaman using a drum, and I had a discussion with Scott about this as well. Just because one shaman uses a drum doesn't mean they all did it, or it's characteristic of the whole function or profession or group of people. So we have to be careful that we don't use a single statement and blow it up to be representative of shamanism. And sometimes this can happen when we have a confirmation bias. It actually happens very easily. But as I said, from the Shang dynasty, I don't see them as drumming, dancing around highly intoxicated people. And this is the end of my presentation. And I think there will be questions coming up later where I can go into other aspects. Just for those who don't know, my chapter specifically revolved around the question if Chinese medicine is based on Wuism or shamanism, because that was a claim that Jeffrey Yuan also made. And so I went back to the Shang dynasty and looked at that and tried to maybe provide more of the evidence and then leave it down to the reader to make a decision or final call on that.
Thank you very much, Johan. That was a panoramic overview. I mean, shamans are supposed to have lived or acted until the 1950s. There is a book you might know that recently has been published, Enchanted Revolution, where you find descriptions from the secretary of the party, a local secretary, who meticulously describes actions of and of course proceedings of shamanistic activities, which is, of course, in a polemic, which are written in a very polemic style, but very interesting. So, yes, but the problem is how to find a common denominator for this term. We don't even find it in Chinese, as I understood from your presentation. And we don't find it, of course. I mean, I had an advisor in anthropology, which was my minor, who was very strict about the use of shamanic and shamanism, and he restricted that to the Siberian people, like the Yevenki or the Samoyeds and some others. And with growing age, he became milder and milder and more lenient to the use of the term. But still, I mean, the question is, of course, to find a kind of common denominator. And I think your decision was wise to have both shamans on the one hand and Wu on the other hand, which does not entirely resolve the problem, but all the articles you gathered in that book, they give us definitely a clearer image, a clearer picture of the question. So I would like to hand over to Justin as the first contributor and discussant at the same time. So please, Justin, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to pick up where Johan left off with, and where you're just speaking as well about shamanism and its roots in Siberia. So he mentioned how a few of these elements that we broadly categorize as belonging to shamanistic practices. So spirit flight, for example, journeying to the underworld, looking within someone, their religious, context as well. And so I want to take that down and show how these practices came down the coast and seemed to migrate into the Yellow River, into the, I'll slow down a little bit, and through the Shandong Peninsula, through the states of Qi and Chu, into southern China in the 2nd century BCE. And I want to show how some of these practices were received in that culture, in the Chu kingdom, and were recontextualized in a different religious sense. And so if we come down from Siberia, as I mentioned, through the Shandong Peninsula, we move through the steppes, through the states of Qi, through the states of Chu. And in the 2nd century BCE, the Chu kingdom was significantly reduced from its original extent and was in eastern China, sharing a border with Qi state. And so I'm going to take us to the mid-century into the court of Huainan, Liyuan, which was a major center of learning at that time. And the Chu aristocracy were in this process of re-justifying their culture and their existence. They had lost to the Qin state and then had lost to a commoner, Liu Bang, in the Civil War. And even though Liu Bang was a Chu southerner himself, he was a common person. And so in the Huainanzi, what we find, and why this is relevant to our discussion and my interest in Chinese medicine, it's a book of late Chu aristocratic religious sentimentality and Chu religious cosmology. And I agree with John Major, for example, that this religious cosmology migrated north into Qi state, where it was naturalized in the Jixia Academy and became the philosophical cosmology that serves as the basis for Chinese medicine. And so I just want to pick out a few concepts that I think are interesting and how some of these facets of shamanism were redefined. And so, for example, in the Huainanzi, this is a text to where correct behavior at the individual or at the large level is a matter of alignment with resonance, what we're familiar with as resonance and response, alignment with patterns of qi, and rather than a moral cosmology, for example, and subscribe to a set of natural law. And while also at the same time, this was a deeply spiritual and religious system as well. And so I want to take this example of spirit and how they were redefining concepts of spirit and religion in a pretty significant way in this century, which is part of my interest. And so in the Huainans, the shamans do appear, but they only appear a few times, and they appear as a device to highlight the text's belief on what spirit is, what sacred is, and how the cosmos are aligned. And so we find a few mentions in there that reveal how they took some of these concepts. I'm going to take one, for example, the mirror. So if we look at shamanistic practices in Siberia, we see them, as Johan mentioned, engaging in spirit flights, using mirrors to protect themselves, using swords to protect themselves, departing the body in certain circumstances, bringing spirits into their body in certain circumstances, using masks, using outfits, using tools that were all considered to be mystical in their potency, basically, truly extraordinary. And so when we look, for example, at what the shaman is doing in the couple instances that we've seen in the Huainanzi, Shaman All Seasons, who appears in the earlier chapters, has a really interesting encounter with an individual who would have represented at the time this self-cultivation program that was popular among Southern Chu aristocratic individuals, the Dao Shu self-cultivation program that the Huainanzi outlines. And so what we find is that the shaman still retains a sense of mystical potency, a sort of religious sense. This name in and of itself, All Seasons, conveys this sort of potency. But when he encounters Hutsa, he does actually see and makes prognostication and in fact diagnosis from what we do in the clinic. He looks at Hutsa and foresees his death. And what he doesn't do is look inside of Hutsa. But he can see the outer form, and that reveals sort of inner mechanisms of Shen. And what this is it's highlighting an important point within the text, that in resonance and response, you can't act directly upon spirit, or upon spirit appears of itself. It can't be commanded, it can't be controlled. And we can only accord with the patterns of spirit chi that are the patterns of the differentiated Tao, but we can't command them. And so what we look at is, for example, is now the mirror. Instead of becoming an external object that guides the shaman, the mirror becomes rendered in the spiritual system the heart. And the heart becomes as a frame, the Shen becomes as the glass. And they internalize this concept of seeing as being internalizing it as part of their aspect of self-cultivation. Similar sort of thing with the drum, for example. Drum pulse, the drum beat becomes the heartbeat. The pulse becomes the beat that we hear coming from the drum that we can rely on. And so the drum, instead of guiding the shaman, for example, through their spirit flight, ends up becoming a guide for the physician as part of their diagnostic process. And I think it's interesting that we go down into, for example, Ma Longdui and the tomb at Changsha, and we find elements of Siberian shamanism. We find mirrors, for example. We find drums that were used ritualistically, silk talismans, for example. And so the conceptual bridge that joined Siberian style shamanism to classical Chinese medicine was really built in the South and then carried north. And so we also see other examples of changing the script. So the journey to spirit flight, for example, which John Major identifies spirit flight as one of the significant features of Chu religious expression. And I think it's noteworthy in the Huainanzi to where this spirit flight is recast internally, to where instead of departing the body and then returning, it becomes a part of a lifelong cultivation process of cultivating one's internal love, virtue, and kindness, maintaining oneself to be full, so as when we meet death, our soul is preserved and we can actually depart and for example, can join with the Tao and cycle it, eternally. So we see the same concept of the soul departing and joining, but is again recast outside of what the authors would have considered a sort of supernatural engagement to one of internal cultivation. So then lastly, one of the items that I like to point out too, because I think it's important for us to help further understand Han Qi dynamics, such as what we find in Chinese medicine, is this concept of resonance, which we often hear as like stimulates like, but that's not exactly correct. It's more like locates like, but like cannot regulate like. And so they would look at it this way, is that two drowning people can't save each other. So what we actually need is a meeting of differences in order to rectify each other. So rather than using, for example, objects that were intended to represent the other agent, they flipped that around a little bit. And we're looking at that magical and sympathetic correspondences weren't how things actually worked. That categorization, developing lake categories, and truly understanding the similarity between things is a lot more difficult than simply looking at the external appearance and matching such as that. So I think it's quite interesting on how these different religious narratives that were coming down out of Siberia that we associate with Siberian shamanism were received in southern China and retold in their religious system, which is something that I think religions have been doing for a long time. And broadly speaking, taking these concepts from being externally sourced to a part of internal self-cultivation. And that's why I'll leave it for now.
Thank you very much, Justin. I'm wondering, I mean, I just read the French translation of the astronomical chapter of the Huainanzi by Mark Kalinowski, and you find the same natural laws there, which you described here. I mean, it's an all-encompassing view of the cosmos, right? And so I would slightly disagree with the use of the word supernatural. I would always say superhuman because this nature is all-encompassing and nothing that really transcends it. We transcend our human sort of condition, the conditio humana, but we transcend it from a point of view of sort of ascending to a superhuman identity or status, right? But that's, I mean, not really important, but it's important for my own take on Chinese philosophy and cosmology. Any question, both, another question, both to you and to Johan is, I mean, you talked about diagnosis. Of course, that is important in medicine. But are there any other kinds of divination you came across while studying your texts?
So
Johan,
yeah, I don't think I actually talked about this clearly, but the oracle bone inscription has this word oracle in that. So it is actually a divination. So in my chapter, I question when you think of Chinese medicine and shamanism and this claim of shamanism being the root of Chinese medicine, what do we identify as Chinese medicine? And for most people, that's acupuncture and herbology. And of course, there's some auxiliary methods like moxibustions and fire therapy and what have you. But these two modalities, Chinese medicine, herbalism, and acupuncture, we don't have any record in the oracle bone inscriptions that they were used by the so-called Wu. So they used divination. And so I had a lot of discussions with the editor, Mark Offord, where just someone must have treated the common people. Like clearly the amount of money it takes to actually cart these turtle shells up to the north is tremendous. So there must have been some just family healing techniques, but we just don't know about them because the kings, they want to have their own life recorded. But based on that, the Wu of China were purely healing through divination. We cannot really say that's the origin of Chinese medicine because divination is quite marginalized when you look at Chinese medicine now. It is still there, and people are now sort of reinvigorating using the I Ching for healing. But it's certainly not the main focus of what people think of Chinese medicine straight away. They wouldn't think about going to a diviner and they're telling them the problem comes from the east, west, or using the I Ching to cure them.
And the only thing we know about diseases come from dreams, of course, inscribed on the oracle bones, you know, toothaches or whatnot. Yes, that's very interesting. Thank you for this contribution. I would like now to hand over to Dominique for her comment, or please,
Yeah,
floor is yours.
thank you. Yeah, it was so much, it was really overwhelming from different point of views. And I do also come from the perspective of Chinese medicine, and I would like to somehow connect to what Michael Lackner just asked, the idea of you are told in Chinese medicine today, and I think for a very long time, that the Wu are the foundation actually for Chinese medicine. So, but if you have a look for the Huangdin Aging, there's only once the term Wu coming up there. And then it is said that it is in a kind of way that the illnesses of the people who lived earlier in golden times, they were not so severe, so they could be healed by shamans and by zhuyo, so by and by seeing, understanding how the illness developed actually. But I am a little bit skeptical whether it could be that easy, and that what you just said, Johan, was it really that we had this, let me call it Wu shamanism, because I know the term is difficult, and also Wu healer, but is it really that they were in the beginning and then Chinese medicine developed? Wouldn't it be much more likely that they existed parallel at the same time, but maybe addressing different aspects of illnesses, maybe in this way, I just go to modernity now with these questions. What would you both see? What is the real maybe necessity or also advantage of healing with Wu potency nowadays? Where we live in a world where we do have Chinese medicine and Western medicine, would there really be any necessity for the Wu, do you think? Or can they bring along something what we don't have right now? So that would be maybe we can discuss around that.
I'd be happy to jump in on that because you bring out a very important feature of what shamans are serving within the Huainanzi. So Johan mentioned vertical and horizontal distribution. The Huainanzi makes it very clear that there's various needs that the people have that need to be addressed at different levels, such as identifying what level our treatment needs to address in the Ling Shu, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And so they recognize that you can't explain chi mechanics to the majority of people. They can only understand what they can see. Mm-hmm. And so shamans become a necessary tool, and you find the exact same language being talked about coming out of like Korea, China right now on exactly what you just said, on how we can't ignore these shamanistic needs because the people demand them and they will demand them. And I will come back to that as it relates to COVID and a slightly different, the modern application of what you just said. But that the reason that back in the day, like you said, in Ling Shu, it says, a long time ago, all we really needed were these shamans. We didn't need direct intervention. And that taps into like that Taoist de-evolutionary, cosmology. But what it's saying is that the best way to not have problems is to have proper arrangement so you don't have problems to begin with. And that comes up with like the sage organizing, society correctly. Mm-hmm. But then the shaman comes in at a very critical point to where the people become startled for some kind of reason. Something happens. I remember in the 2nd century BCE, especially around 150, Zhang Shu's omen theory was becoming quite popular and then was adopted not too long after in 136. And so it was popular in the time to see things and have this recognition of it startles people and then they misbehave. So they say that the shaman is not using sympathetic magic. You can't act on spirit directly. They deny that strongly. What they're doing is a form of psychotherapy, and calming people's fears and anger, so their attention goes back inside their body. Because as we know, the jur attends to things outside the body. Where our attention goes, our life force attaches to it. So they're really saying, whether it's at the individual level or even like epidemics at the time, shamans would come out and hold events basically that would calm the people down. Mm-hmm. So they're serving a very important function, which is trying to calm the chi dynamic. So the shen returns. So we stave off disease before someone like me or yourself or our practitioner friends need to come along and poke them with needles, which is a military form of intervention. We're taking direct action on something when a problem has already taken root. Now, when you mention the modern application, I will give an example of COVID. And my friend Craig Thompson's book, where he writes about ginseng roots, and why this is relevant is the among people up in Wisconsin during COVID, reached out to a well-known member within their community who had given up his shamanistic roots previously and became a priest. But they came to him and begged him to come back and do to come back into his shamanistic role. And we see the same thing, to give them a sense of order and calm once again, right? Repositing authority within oneself. And I think that that's a wonderful, I mean, that answers exactly what you just said, is that we can't ignore the role of these deeply held cultural belief systems, and that these acts of psychotherapy are necessary forms of intervention to stave off and ward off disease and create societal harmony.
And if I may ask back, where would you see the difference now between the very individual psychotherapy and the therapy of a shaman or a womb?
I agree largely with the point of view of the Huayanzi, which takes on this view that the objects of ritual don't enjoy, the sacrifice. They state quite clearly that these are practices that were invented by the sages long ago to address the fears of the people. And when I see modern day what appear to me to be shamanistic rituals, they are very different than my clinical engagement. And so so where we have to come back to that ultimately traces us back to an individual's religious belief system, basically, and how you render God, how you render the sacred, and how you render spirit. And the Finance is a deeply religious book, and so really taking to the ultimate we do in the clinic, which is, if we preserve our chi dynamic throughout our life, then we maintain our shen, and when we die, we maintain the integrity of our soul, and we get to fly and cycle forever, basically. Which is something that I believe in. And so I'm not sure if that's answering your question exactly, but that ultimately each individual is going to have to decide, can you act upon spirit directly? Or do you have to influence spirit by acting on the form? And remember that form is our physical body, it's our actions, and it's our thought forms, as the Finanza says, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's also said.
And that's how the shaman acts. They act on, to answer your question, shamanistic rituals act on thought forms, so they're not rigid, and that they can flow.
Thank you. So, Johan, maybe you also want to add something, and also to the question how much the Wu are really, can be said, like the foundation of Chinese medicine, or have we to see that maybe there was something, what in my ears was a little bit your suggestion to say they are the normal people who don't have, who are not very rich, but they also were ill. So there must be some methods for helping them. So maybe it was a parallel or a
Sure. So there's two
development.
main possibilities I can see, and this is assumption because I don't have a textual evidence for this. One of them is that the Wu also in some form catered for the normal people, the populace, or that we have a complete different, I call it maybe a caste or group of people, or maybe it was just family there. It was just passed on within sort of like family, what we now call a lineage-based system. But I'm hoping that at some stage we dig something up, a text or more oracle bones or other bones where we get an insight into this, because we don't know anything about the common people. We don't know what they ate. We don't know what they wore. We have literally just questions. Is the hunt of the king going to be successful tomorrow? And then the charge, which is the negative, is this hunt not successful? So it's very almost like a tunnel vision, very narrow in what we know about the royal elite and the retinue of the king. And in terms of divination, I would call it divination as a treatment method, which really starts with the U. I think it's very valid to have many strings to your bow. So, of course, if we could heal everything with just herbs, then all the other modalities would have probably died out by now. But I think once you use one method, herbs that don't work, maybe use acupuncture. Maybe then you look at their history and you're like, oh, they have massive childhood trauma, and maybe psychology, whatever form, Eastern or Western that is. And so divination, I think it depends also on your skill level. If you can cure everything with a divination treatment, why resort to the other ones? But it's good to have to be skilled and adept in many methods.
So if I understand you right, you would say it is also an assumption that the Wu are the foundation for Chinese medicine.
It's even more. I would say it's a bold claim, because when we define, I think definitions are very important, because if I've been asked, do I believe in enlightenment? I usually ask, what do you mean by enlightenment? Because understanding can vary, and so my answer could be misinterpreted or actually be outright wrong. And so when we say Chinese medicine, do we incorporate divination? I think very few practitioners these days use divination in their everyday practice. If we include divination, then you can make a case and be like, yeah, divination started with a U. But if you think about herbs and acupuncture, at least of what we have written in the records, you can't say a clear yes. You can have a hypothesis. I think the U also did that on the side. But then that's really where our discussion ends, because it's like your assumption versus my assumption, or what we like to believe in. But it's an interesting topic. I think it's very interesting. I think it's very important to talk about it, to at least make people aware how multifaceted it is and not clear-cut and straightforward.
Dear colleagues, we're getting close to the end of our conversation, but I take the liberty to ask another question, which you already alluded to. You know that Steve Corey and recently and Richard Smith have emphasized the role of female diviners in some of their articles. And there is apparently an article by Elena Valusi about the role of female shamans. Now, when I get to the, once again, to this book about the 1950s and the campaigns against so-called Wu shamans, they're all male. And they were framed as threats to rural women. Propaganda cast peasant women as symbolic victims requiring party salvation, etc., etc. But they're all male. And but as a matter of fact, if we look to Korea and other places, I mean, we have a lot of female Wu, in fact. May I ask you to say more or less a final, to give us, provide us with a final contribution about that question?
I think it's very difficult to answer, because we talk about time periods. So the reason why I went back to the Shang is that people can't really say, well, I have some records from the Xia dynasty, which we don't have. And so the meaning of Wu changed vastly. And so Wu later on became synonymous with what we call witches, and there's not a good male version, wizard, sorcerer, sorceress, very negative. And so they were feared. And I do think that has to do with just like originally them being sort of outcast to the south and to the outskirts, so away from the center, where the government had their residence. And so these people talk about different times, I believe. I think Elena Valusi focuses on Ming dynasty and Qing with the females.
He does. That's her specialty. Yes, in fact.
And so we are far removed from the Shang dynasty, and there's many dynasties between that. And so I believe it started off as male Wu, and then it changed over time. So if there, as you said, there's enough evidence that later on there were male, but I think it changed. We started off with male, and then it's probably also depends on the local area, whether you have predominant male or female shamans. So it's very hard, because it's also, some people really need to focus on that to research that. Like, it's one specific point.
And when it comes to this kind of practices, of course, there are shifts of meaning. and look at the use of the word jianghu, the expression jianghu, which still in the 11th century mean noble people who had retired, the sort of the noble hermit on the one hand, and later on became something like Sherwood Forest, or those outcasts who lived in the lakes and rivers, and that became entirely pejorative, as you say, for the Wu, for instance. And it's interesting that you have a positive connotation at the beginning or at a certain moment, and then an entirely or mostly negative connotation at the end.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and also, yeah, you just have to look. You have to clarify what area, what era are you talking about? Area and what era are you talking about when you're talking about Wu? It has flipped completely around. Like Jianghu later was like vagabonds or charlatans. It was
Exactly.
incredibly negative.
Yes, in fact, yeah. So we have to close now. Thank you very much for your participation. I hope your book will find lots of readers, and hope to see you soon all in Erlangen, perhaps.